Autumn settled heavy and damp over Breathitt County. By late October, the evening fog, rolling off the North Fork of the Kentucky River, wrapping around the steep ridges and filling the hollows with a chill that bit straight through a denim jacket. Tony knew those woods and tracks better than anyone. He lived in South Jackson, down near the old rail lines. Back then, the Louisville and Nashville and its successor lines still carried the weight of the mountains. Hauling coal from the deep eastern Kentucky mines, though parts of the tracks and old rail beds were already beginning to quiet down, reclaimed by encroaching kudzu and briars. For the old-timers in Jackson, walking the ties after dark was a fool's errand. They didn't talk much about it to outsiders, but everyone local knew about the rail walker of South Jackson. The story went back to the steam days of the early 1900s, when the line was pushing hard through the foothills. A brakeman, some say his name was Caleb, that he got caught between two coal guns on a pitch-black rainy midnight. The lantern slipped from his hand, plunging into the ballast, and the heavy iron crushed him before he could cry out over the roar of the steam engine. They say the company cleared the line by morning, but they never quite cleared the man. Ever since, on nights when the river fog choked the tracks and the moon hid behind the ridges, a solitary lantern's light would bob up and down the rails just south of town, looking for a handfold that wasn't there. On a Friday night, Tony was walking back from a friend's place, over near the edge of town. He had a battered transistor radio pressed to his ear, listening to a faint, crackling broadcast, and a pack of cigarettes rolled up in his sleeve. To cut 20 minutes off his walk home, he climbed the embankment and dropped onto the L&N rail bed, using the smooth wooden ties as a makeshift walkway through the thicket. The night was dead silent, apart from the crunch of gravel under his Chuck Taylors and the distant, lonely chirp of crickets down by the river. Then the crickets stopped. Tony paused, pulling the radio away from his ear. The absolute quiet of an Appalachian night settled over the tracks. Clack, clack, clack. Down the straightaway, swallowed entirely by the rolling fog, came a rhythmic sound. It wasn't the heavy, industrial rumble of a locomotive. It was the distinct, deliberate sound of heavy work boots, stepping uniformly on steel rails. "Who's there?" Tony called out, his voice sounding thin and small against the massive, black walls of the ridge. The footsteps stopped instantly. From out of the dense fog, about 50 yards ahead, a small, pale orb of yellow light flickered to life. It looked like the glow of an old wick brakeman's lantern, swaying back and forth in a slow, hypnotic arc. Tony's stomach tightened. He wanted to turn back, but the embankment was steep and slick with wet clay. He stayed put, gripping the strap of the radio. "Hey, you're on a private right-of-way," Tony yelled, trying to sound braver than he felt. The light didn't answer. Instead, it started moving forward again. Clack, clack, clack. As the figure drew closer through the haze, Tony's breath caught in his throat. It was a tall man wearing a heavy soot-stained canvas duck coat and a low-slung conductor's cap, dressed straight out of an era before his own grandfather was born. But it was the face that made Tony's blood run cold. Beneath the cap, the man didn't have distinct features, just a pale, hollow blur, like looking through a smear of grease on a window pane. And in his left hand, he carried a rusted railroad lantern that smelled fiercely of coal oil and scorched iron. The phantom stopped just 10 feet away. The air around Tony plummeted 10 degrees, his breath pluming white in the autumn air. Then the thing raised its head, and a distinct voice that sounded like grinding metal and whispering wind through a trestle. It spoke.
"You're walking on my time, boy."
Tony didn't think. He spun around and scrambled blindly down the rocky embankment, sliding the last 6 feet on his backside into a thick patch of briars and sticker bushes. Brambles clawed at his face and tore his jeans, but he scrambled up, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, landing just feet from the edge of Railroad Street. Tony quickly gets to his feet, heart racing, and a dead run down the dark street. He didn't look back until he reached the safety of his porch, slamming the screen door shut and locking the deadbolt with trembling hands. As he stood in the dim light of the hallway, catching his breath and picking burrs out of his jacket, he heard it, faint, muffled, and echoing up from the distant tracks, cutting straight through the wood of the floorboards. Clack, clack, clack. Tony never walked the L&N tracks after dark again. And to this day, down in South Jackson, if you're out near the old rail bed when the river fog rolls in and you see a dim yellow light bobbing in the distance, you don't call out. Just walk the other way. Tony shared his encounter with the phantom rail walker over breakfast the next morning, his voice still tight with lingering dread as he recounted the freezing air and the smell of scorched iron to his wife and daughters, Teresa and Pam. He swore off the tracks for good, and for a while life moved on. Tony soon found himself no longer needing to walk the dark roads around town anyway. The family saved up and purchased a shiny silver Monte Carlo with a powerful big block engine and a point of pride that sat gleaming in the driveway. Months later, Tony began working as a coal truck driver for Falcon Coal. His Mack truck would groan under the weight, the brakes feeling dangerously soft as he hugged the steep mountain curves. With a rhythmic, humbling rumble, the engine puffed plumes of thick black smoke from the tailpipe. Static crackled over the CB radio. Tony pressed the handle, his voice steady.
"Breaker, breaker 19, this is the Phantom, coming at you hot from Town Hill."
He'd earned the nickname from his buddies after sharing his chilling singular encounter on the train tracks that autumn night years ago. He turned the truck onto Railroad Street and backed it into the narrow alley between his home and the neighbors. The hydraulic bed let out a high-pitched whine as he dumped the remnant coal. The remnant coal was shoveled into buckets to keep their home warm through the winter. Months later, autumn settled heavy over Breathitt County once again. It was at night, just like the first fateful evening. A dense, blinding fog had rolled off the North Fork of the Kentucky River, blanketing Railroad Street in a ghostly white shroud. The moonlight barely pierced the haze, and the single, dimly lit street lamp flickered overhead, casting long, jittery shadows in the complete, chilling silence. Tony pulled the Monte Carlo up to the mouth of the road, letting the engine idle with a low, confident purr. Beside of him, another local pulled up, in a rumbling Ford Mustang, revving the pipes until the exhaust echoed off the steep ridge. The two drivers looked at one another, through the fog-swirled air, nodding in an unspoken, reckless agreement. They laid the hammer to the floor. The Monty's rear tires burned rubber, screaming against the asphalt as the car surged forward, picking up speed down the old road. But the thick river fog rushed in like a wall, completely obliterating the windshield view. The world shrank to the narrow cone of Tony's headlights, slicing frantically through the white mist. Then out of the haze, a figure loomed directly in their path, tall, wearing a soot-stained canvas duck coat and a low-slung conductor's cap, holding a dim yellow lantern that swung in a slow, hypnotic arc. Clack, clack, clack. Tony jerked the wheel hard to avoid the apparition. There was a deafening crunch of twisted metal. The Monte Carlo smashed head-on into a thick oak tree, just off the shoulder of the old road. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the hollow as red and blue lights flashed against the fog. The driver of the Mustang had managed to skid to a halt, stumbling out of his car with shaking hands, unharmed but pale with shock. But inside, the crumpled front end of the Monty, the heavy impact had knocked Tony unconscious. By the time the paramedics arrived and fought to clear the wreckage, it was too late. They were unable to revive him. Just doors down from the tragic scene, a grief-stricken family made the solemn arrangements, laying Tony to rest a few days later up in the quiet stillness of Kings Branch Cemetery, overlooking the winding river valley. For years, Teresa, Pam, and her mother kept the old transistor radio on the shelf, and when the late October fog rolls in off the North Fork, wrapping around the ridges of South Jackson, they still remember Tony's wide-eyed warning about the phantom rail walker and the chilling double meaning behind the ghost words, "You're walking on my time, boy." Yet Tony never entirely left the house. It always happened around 2 a.m., right as the river fog pressed thickest against the window panes. The old battered static transistor radio Tony had carried the night he met the rail walker would sit silently on the shelf in the hallway. Then softly, the speaker would let out a faint, crackling squelch of static. At first, the sudden sound deep in the dead of night startled Teresa, sending a jolt of ice straight through her chest. But as the months wore on, the fear dissolved into something else. She stopped jumping. Instead, she would lie awake in the dark, listening to the low, rhythmic hum of the ghostly signal cutting through the static. She felt an uncanny, profound comfort in it, a silent, supernatural tether stretching from the quiet hill of Kings Branch Cemetery right back to the hallway. Whenever the radio whispered in the dark, Teresa knew her father was still walking his beat, anchored forever to the rails in the mist, keeping a steady, protective watch over his home.